we now go to Berlin, where we have Tyson Barker with the GAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations, where he leads the Technology and Global Affairs program. And Tyson will now deliver his keynote address for this year's Chernin Security Forum. So Tyson, please.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to the Chernin Security Forum for having me today, and for NATO Public Diplomacy, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and of course, the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs for making this possible. I am going to take a slightly broader approach to this question to start, because I think that the title of this conference was actually quite apt to deal with the security dimensions of digital transformation. And as I think that the agenda shows, that moves beyond cybersecurity alone. So what I want to do is kind of drill down into one aspect of the geopolitics of technology, namely the transatlantic relationship, which is an area that I've been focused on, and talk about it from different slices. But let me start by just saying what is the kind of organizing logic of today's security environment. I think that if you look at all the crises that Europe, Czechia, the United States, the world the democratic order is facing right now, it's facing a crisis of connectivity. And that takes many forms, but in some ways, the operating system behind it has some commonalities. It really is about states and private actors controlling flows and hubs of different types of information, people, finance, etc. And that one of the key elements of power is the ability to control choke points. So if you look at different areas that we're confronting right now, be it in migration, where we see the weaponization of flows of migrants from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria via Belarus, or the EU-Turkey pact in 2016, and the way that the Turks also negotiated directly with the European Union, we see that this idea of controlling flows and hubs and choke points is key in migration. We see the same kind of dynamic playing out in the area of energy and climate change. Energy and climate change connectivity is, again, a key dimension of geopolitics today. We see this with Nord Stream 2, for example, or even COP commitments of systemically important players like the United States, China, and Brazil. We see it in financial connectivity. Lifting of capital controls in the 80s and early 90s led to a lot of capital movement, which has created the potential for asset bubbles in property, art, stocks. And today, now we're looking at it with cryptocurrencies and non-fungible tokens, but also the ability for authoritarian and corrupt elites to move capital wealth out of their countries. So again, controlling the flows and moving these assets abroad, that idea of connectivity is central to the financial aspect of geopolitics. In trade connectivity, with supply chain constraints, which we're seeing right now with semiconductors and metals, for example. Of course, we would be remiss without talking about health connectivity, which we're seeing with vaccine availability, the continued movement of people and mutations as we are currently confronting the Omicron variant and trying to figure out what this means for the future of European security. And finally, and of course, this is what we're here to talk about today, is digital connectivity. We all know that the role that online gatekeepers play has become a key vector of power and security in our democratic societies. And it is something that the European Union, for example, is trying to address through the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. But we also see it in the question not just around data and software and algorithms, but also in ICT hardware and its ability to tilt the scales to certain players through creating path dependencies and the potential for surveillance or connectivity shutdowns. And this is why the debate around 5G and Huawei has been so present in the past year and a half. And finally, of course, in cybersecurity, we wouldn't have the vulnerabilities we have today in hospitals, in municipalities, with pipelines, if we weren't all connected. So digital connectivity is both a facilitator and enabler of prosperity and democracy, but is also a vector of vulnerability. And so I want to, of course, drill deeper into this last area of digital connectivity, talking about, what is the kind of security environment that we are confronting in the 20s. And I think NATO gave a really good phrase in the 2021 reflection group to describe the kind of scenario that we're facing when they said that we're facing a moment of strategic simultaneity. Whereas in the past, we were confronted with maybe one or two threats or vulnerabilities, especially in the technological space. Now we're being confronted with the rise of multiple general purpose technologies coming online at the same time, all of which are going to have major disruptive impacts on the security environment. So if you think back about what general purpose technologies are, those are technologies that are not just dual use, that can have civilian and military usages, but also basically make the DNA of many different types of use cases. So in the past, we had, for example, the telegraph or electricity, which facilitated an entire new way of organizing societies, essentially. And right now, we're facing a moment where we have 6 or 7 similar style general purpose technologies coming online at the same time. We have quantum computing, we have artificial intelligence, we have high performance computing, blockchain technology, biotechnology, and of course, as we've been talking about in the past 6 weeks, but I think it's going to be increasingly prominent in the discussion as we move towards 6G, augmented reality and virtual reality. And because this technology is so potent as a security, potential security vulnerability and enabler of prosperity and democracy, it is increasingly being securitized itself. We're seeing countries think about what are the strategic dimensions of all these technologies and how can we make sure that we control those flows, those choke points, those hubs. So let me talk through 5 kind of themes or elements that we're seeing in the current digital connectivity landscape right now. The first is, of course, this rise of general purpose technologies. The second, and I think everybody recognizes this, is the increasing move towards competition between the United States and China, where technology itself and access to and control of technology is a central vector. The third is the rise of digital authoritarianism, not only in states with strong capacity, but increasingly in states with weak state capacity that are building up their capacity to consolidate control through technologies. And we see this across the board in the global south, where the allure of surveillance technology is becoming hard to resist for would-be authoritarians that are slowly tilting in the direction of a kind of techno-authoritarianism. Of course, we see this with the use of the NSO technology to surveil and monitor opposition in a number of states, including in the European Union, unfortunately. The fourth is this new awareness that I think we all have of dependencies and vulnerabilities that COVID has facilitated. So COVID was the great accelerator in technological adoption. And traditionally, adoption of technology is the actual metric by which you can judge power. It's not who creates the technology, it's who adopts the technology. What COVID has done is just push the warp speed on technological adoption. Of course, we're all using Zoom these days, but it has also made people aware, both at the elite level and the popular level, of what are our actual dependencies. And I will get into some survey data which talks about where Europe sees its dependencies and vulnerabilities. The fifth is a new renaissance in tech industrial policy. And in the European Union, we see this with the Next Gen European Union proposal, the stimulus, where a lot of countries are submitting national plans, are actually required to put 20% towards digitization. A lot of national plans are geared towards next-gen technologies like semiconductor production and research, like artificial intelligence, et cetera. But this is, of course, happening in other powers as well. The United States has kind of rebooted its tech industrial policy with a law that will give around $250 billion to the creation of technologies to compete directly with China, including $50 billion in something called the CHIPS Act, which I will talk about later, which is meant to repatriate production, packaging, research, and design to the United States of high-end semiconductor technology. And just two things that I want to mention as a final in this theme bucket is the breakdown of the ICT and digital international system. Like in other areas, the WTO, trade, even security arrangements, we are seeing a fraying of the rules of the road, the norms that have existed since the end of the Cold War that allowed for a seamless integration of the digital landscape as states like Russia and China in particular create data localization, roll out a lot more surveillance technology, but also try to create indigenous standards. So both Russia and China, for example, are putting the domain name system under intense strain because they want to repatriate the essentially the DNA of the internet and renationalize it, re-Westphalianize that. And then finally, and I think this will be the topic of this conversation over the next 2 days, a massive increase in cyber operations that we've seen in the past year and a half, particularly on supply chain and ransomware incidents. So what does this mean for Europe? I'm an American. I used to work at the US State Department, but I am sitting in Berlin and engaged in conversations in Europe on this topic and have been watching the evolution of the debate around these kind of digital vulnerabilities and the sense that Europe is not competing at its optimal level in the global tech race. So, of course, in 2019, Ursula von der Leyen said this is going to be Europe's digital decade. The European Union and member states have all been going through a fundamental rethink of how to make sure that Europe is a peer competitor with the United States and China when it comes to emerging disruptive technologies and its tech industrial base. Focused heavily on some of the areas of indigenous strengths that Europe already has, particularly in the area of the Internet of Things and the industrial internet, and B2B platforms like dealing with things like logistics. These are all areas that Europe is trying to double down on. But at the German Council on Foreign Relations, we did a survey at the beginning of the year to see how Europeans or how European stakeholders, so those involved in these debates at the elite level, perceive Europe's capacity to act in 5 key enabling technologies: artificial intelligence, cloud computing, semiconductors, 5 and 6G, mobile network technology, and quantum technology. And here's what we found that Europe saw in its own ability. So 76% of Europeans believe that the EU is too dependent on external actors when it comes to cloud computing. 68 believe it's too dependent on external actors when it comes to artificial intelligence. 54 believe it's too dependent when it comes to 5G, and 41 believe it's too dependent on quantum computing from external actors. So clearly there is a perception that Europe is vulnerable because a lot of this technological development is occurring elsewhere. In 6 of the 7 technologies that we surveyed, the dependence was seen as most great on the United States. And that informs to some extent, or has informed in the past, and I think that this is changing, but how Europe wants to position itself strategically in the global tech race. So when we asked, how should Europe deal with the US-China tech confrontation or tech competition, 46% of Europeans said that Europe should move closer to the United States. And 54% said that Europe should remain independent. So chart that third way. And that's where we come to an evolving definition or evolving idea of digital sovereignty, where Europe is a co-equal, but perhaps not aligned pillar between the United States or less aligned pillar between the United States and China, which is, I would say, quite worrying for many of us who have watched the development of technology globally and know its security implications. So what does Europe see as its obstacles for developing this capacity to act indigenously? We surveyed, again, in this survey, we found 4 areas that were kind of the tops. The first was the lack of dominant incumbent players. So it lacks Google's, it lacks Tencent's, it lacks Apple, et cetera, Samsung. The second was the lack of ability to commercialize research and development. So, of course, there is great research and development being done in Europe, from the invention of the World Wide Web by CERN to the development of the MP3 to amazing basic research at IMEC on semiconductors, but the ability to commercialize that research is lacking. The third is lack of venture capital, was seen as a hindrance to Europe's development to a peer status with the United States and China. And the fourth was a lack of a coherent strategy at the European level. So what would Europe's global objectives be if it were able to obtain this kind of peer status? So we surveyed, we got a number of different topics, and here I will give you guys the top 4 areas, and then we'll move into the transatlantic space, because I really want to talk about this Trade and Technology Council that the European Union and the United States launched about a month and a half ago. So in Europe's global objectives, this is what Europe would like to see its international identity in technology be. First, it wants to foster greater global competitiveness. So i.e., wants to make sure that there is a level playing field, that it's not dominated by, specific players, key players, be it in the software or platform space, or in the hardware space, where the lock-in effects can really lead to vulnerabilities, be it from Huawei or from GAFA. The second is to advance sustainability and combat climate change. And I think that is an important element that needs to be taken on more in the digital policy of the European Union, both at home and abroad. The third, and this is important for this round, as a global objective, is advancing responsible behavior in cyberspace. That was seen as the third most important priority for the European Union in its tech policy globally. And the fourth was to further digital rights and democratic technology globally. So those are the areas where Europe sees its most important contribution to the global dynamic around geopolitics of technology. Areas that it saw as less important or most difficult, and I think these are interesting to flag, because I think it gives a flavor of how Europeans see their role globally. It sees it too difficult to try to shape the legal basis for emerging technologies in military contexts. So Europe does not want to engage as much in the question of how, for example, lethal autonomous weapon systems are deployed. Now, if you look at something like, for example, the coalition agreement coming out of the incoming German government, you see a lot about arms control, bans on certain emerging technologies in military contexts. But at least at the European level, this is seen as a low priority. And in very last place, and I think this is quite worrying as a global objective for Europe, is elevating tech access and adoption in the global South. And of course, we all know that the Global South, with the lock-in effects that come from the rollout of ICT infrastructure, with all the security, the cybersecurity dimensions that are around the use of undersea cables, the use of mobile technology, the use of handsets, the use of digital services, payment systems, et cetera, that come with it, the Global South is a key theater in the effort to establish an open, interoperable, democratic technology landscape. So when I was talking to the organizer of this conference, I said, I would prefer to talk about the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council because I see this as a potential nascent tech alliance in the Euro-Atlantic space, somewhat complementary to what the United States is doing with the Quad in the Indo-Pacific space. And I want to give kind of an outline of some of the points that I see as potential for a positive democratic tech agenda. So why is the transatlantic data corridor important? Well, first of all, this corridor, despite the fact that there's a lot of growth in the Indo-Pacific, the massive size of this relationship still dwarfs the United States' relationship with the Pacific. So as an economic matter, the transatlantic economic relationship is about $7.1 trillion, 1.3 trillion of which is based in data flows. So it's a very service-based relationship. So that's just to give you a sense. I believe that's about the size of the economy of, I don't know, Spain. And transatlantic undersea cables, so the internet cables going between the United States and Europe, carry 55% more data flows than trans-Pacific cables. So there's a lot more connectivity, a lot more interaction along those undersea cables than even in the Pacific, and 40% more than the US and Latin America. So what is the TTC and why is this something that was conceived of and called to life? Well, the commission approached the Biden administration when it came into office with this idea for a trade and technology council, a means of essentially establishing a Euro-Atlantic, I would say, tech alliance to address some of these questions around connectivity that have reemerged as all these general purpose technologies have been coming online. And after some degree of review, it was basically declared in the US-EU summit in the summer when Biden was in Brussels. And it had its first meeting with the 5 co-chairs on September 29th in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, a great location to do this because, of course, Pittsburgh was the former US and perhaps global capital of coal and steel, the former, metric vector of state power. Coal and steel, as of course we know in Europe, the European coal and steel community. And today we're looking at a space where digital technology is the primary vector of state power. So they held it on September 29th. 5 co-chairs attended. The co-chairs are Margarita Vestager, the Executive Vice President for Digital of the European Union, Valdis Dombrovskis, the Executive Vice President for Trade and Economy for the European Commission. And on the US side, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, Gina Raimondo, Secretary of Commerce, and Catherine Tai, the US Trade Representative, all attended. They released after their meeting, it was a 2-day meeting actually, a joint statement, 17 pages. I would encourage people to read it. It is a really interesting document. It includes 5 annexes. And in that statement, they started to outline the work of 10 working groups. And I will not read off all the 10 working groups, but I can tell you that they are all working constantly. They have mandates to connect, and there's dashboards to make sure that they are connecting to see how they can set up progress for the future. What I'd rather do is say, basically, I put them all in roughly 3 baskets, 3 strategic baskets that I think are important for the geopolitics of technology in the transatlantic relationship. The first is the question of strategic interdependence, i.e., can the United States and the European Union graft themselves together in a way that is mutually beneficial to both sides. So you don't have asymmetric dependencies in select areas, and you don't have this kind of awareness of overdependence, as we saw in the survey data that I read earlier. And the area that I think that both sides are quite focused on right now, where they want to do this, is in the area of semiconductors. Both the United States and Europe are pursuing a semiconductor industrial policy to develop new capabilities. Just to give you guys a sense, in 1990, the European Union had 44% of global semiconductor manufacturing capability. It has around 8% today. The United States, by contrast, had 37% of global semiconductor manufacturing capability in 1990 and has around 12% today. China consumes around 60% of global semiconductors, or most global semiconductors move towards China at some point in the life cycle. And that is because, of course, China remains the assembly factory of the world. Handsets, computers, a lot of smart devices, autos, a lot of this stuff, at some point, a lot of the components have some time in China. So both the United States and the European Union are aware of, a lack of capacity in semiconductors. The semiconductor market, I should say, is quite differentiated. There's mature market semiconductors, which are currently used in things like automobiles, a lot of which, includes the Czech Republic in its supply chain. These are what Bosch and Infineon make. And then there's this kind of high-end semiconductor in development right now, which is smaller than 10 nanometers. And as of right now, there's only one factory in the world that can really produce these. It's TSMC in Taiwan, a very geopolitically fraught place, a neighborhood, of course. And the desire, I think, for both the United States and Europe is to make sure that capacity is a little more diffuse, because you don't want to have an over-reliance on an area that is so geostrategically risky. Now, there are questions, particularly in Europe. The United States is going full force in trying to develop high-end semiconductors, because they see it as the future, not only of military technology, which it is, but it will play a key component in things like autonomous vehicles, or smart factories, or smart cities, or the fusion of radio access networks or RAN nodes in 6G with edge computing. So as the cloud moves more closely to the source, to handsets, et cetera, smaller, more high-performing chips is going to be quite key. So the demand for high-performance chips is going to increase. Both the United States and Europe have interesting assets that they can bring to the table. Both are doing really interesting basic research. The United States has a lot of capacity on design. The European Union has a lot of capacity on equipment manufacturing through ASML and optics and lasers from German companies like Trumpf and Zeiss. And the idea is to say, okay, well, we're all coming online with a lot of new industrial policy funding. Can we create transatlantic consortia that really create supply chain resilience on both sides of the Atlantic and graft these economies together? I think that is the project of strategic interdependence that both sides are pursuing. And that will be a major test case for the Trade and Technology Council's worth, but it could have massive payoff in terms of both creating competitiveness and building a relationship that is fit for purpose for the 21st century. The second area I would talk about, I categorize roughly as, general technology access and control, or I term it democratic autonomy. So how can the United States and Europe coordinate better at every stage of the process to see if dual use export controls on emerging technologies, investment screening, FDI screening, outbound investment, trustworthy vendors in areas, not just 5 and 6G equipment, but also things like surveillance cameras, artificial intelligence, cargo screening, even to perhaps handsets, because as we know from reporting out of Lithuania, Xiaomi handsets it's possible for them to censor certain content. How do we take this whole basket of, you want market access to our market, and you want our investment, or you want to invest in our democratic space? Well, that's going to come with certain costs or certain requirements. So the United States and Europe, through the TTC, perhaps also with NATO, need to develop a much more robust information sharing regime that allows for data to be shared, not just about the kind of criteria used for FDI screening or export controls, but also perhaps even intelligence on specific cases. And of course, that's highly sensitive, which is why I think that NATO might actually be an interesting player in this space, not just the US-EU relationship, but also allowed to bring in other states. But this idea of basically saying, okay, our democratic space having access to the crown jewels, our consumers and our technology and IP, comes with certain democratic requirements that are going to have to be met, is something that I think that the TTC could really, really foster. And if you look at the list of working groups, there are several that will be addressing this more acutely. There's working group 3, which is on secure supply chains. There's working group 4, which is on ITC security and competitiveness. There's working group 7, which is export controls, working group 8, which is FDI screening. So I think that there is potential to really develop a kind of dashboard in this relationship to pull this off. The third area that I would note is the Global Rulebook. Both sides of the Atlantic are looking to create more democratic governance in how technology is governed. The European Union is much further along in this process, but there has been a lot of convergence between the two sides on questions like data protection, on questions around disinformation and the monitoring of online content, on digital services tax, which we've successfully concluded through the adoption or the pending adoption of a global minimum corporate tax, on artificial intelligence. And if you look at this first Pittsburgh document, you already see the convergence around risk-based assessments for artificial intelligence and the banning of social scoring, or the idea that social scoring is not a good thing, especially by states, especially when it has the allure of being used by authoritarian states. So there's a lot of potential here. It's also quite fraught, and I can get into some of the reasons why it's fraught in a second. So those are the 3 areas that I see the most potential in the TTC: the Global Rulebook, democratic autonomy, strategic interdependence. Now, in this kind of nascent tech alliance environment, the Commission has been very sensitive to the concerns of member states and has said basically that there are 4 no's, 4 areas that they don't want to pursue. The first is they want to make sure that everybody is aware that this isn't a TTIP zombie. It's not a TTIP redux. This is not dealing with questions around agriculture. It's not dealing with questions around investment. It's just about future technologies and the geopolitical dimensions of future technologies. Second, the Commission has been at pains to say it's not an anti-China alliance. This is a little more complicated than the Commission's line, because if you look at the joint statement out of Pittsburgh, it contains a lot of phrases like, we need to watch for the way that non-market economies are behaving, or we need to guard against civil-military fusion, or the use of social scoring by authoritarian states. All of that is code for China. But still, particularly because of sensitivities in Germany, the Commission is at pains to say this is not an anti-China alliance. Third, and maybe this will be a topic of discussion in the next 2 days, it's not a place to discuss Privacy Shield 2.0. So, after the Snowden revelations, after the ECJ decision related to FISA 702, there is not a corridor for the transfer for data flows from the European Union to the United States, a clear corridor for personally identifiable information. And because these negotiations are already very sensitive, it's being handled outside of the TTC context. And finally, it's not a place to discuss live legislation, i.e. the Digital Markets Act, for example. So those are kind of like the pillars of this new relationship at its outset. The question about TTC is, will it have member state buy-in? And I think that if you look at what happened around AUKUS and the French attempt to postpone the TTC, which would have effectively probably put it on ice, there is still a question of whether or not member state buy-in exists. That's an area where especially Czech, Central European, Nordic support is going to be key for the success of this process. And the second is on outreach. It's going to be very important to engage a wide range of stakeholders, lest the perception develop that this is being negotiated behind closed doors. The European Commission has worked to do this with its Futurium platform. It has had several stakeholder sessions on different areas. But as we've seen with ACTA, with Upload Filter, with TTIP, with the protests around the referendum, the Ukrainian referendum in the Netherlands on the AA-DCFTA, there's a lot of potential for grassroots or supported by state actors who don't want to see this process succeed to arise. And if that does, particularly in some vulnerable European countries, I think this process will become very difficult to get off the ground. And since I know I've got a couple minutes left, since I know this is a cyber conference, I thought I would mention a little bit on cyber. Cyber is not a key component, although the security of ICT within the Trade and Technology Council. But US-European cyber cooperation is quite key, and there has been a revival of a dialogue on cybersecurity, addressing all the dimensions of cybersecurity. So data operations, so maintaining the integrity, confidentiality, and accessibility of data, kinetic operations, which I think is what many people still continue to think about when they think about cyber operations, and of course, information operations, which Vice President Jourova mentioned. I see two big issues that need to be addressed in 2022 on US-European cooperation on cyber. One is the question, and this is the big one, is the question of consequences. The European Union now has a cyber diplomacy toolbox. It has imposed sanctions on 8 individuals and 4 organizations starting last year as a reaction to the Bundestag hack in 2015, WannaCry, NotPetya. That's a good start. But so far this year, which has been a year of accelerating cyber operations, there have been no impositions of sanctions using the cyber diplomacy toolbox. The United States, in the same period, has imposed 99 sanctions on 99 individuals and 59 entities, including 13 individuals and 19 entities just this year alone. So, for example, when you look at what has happened with SolarWinds and the reaction, there was a statement by the European Union, but there was no action, no consequences that came afterwards. And of course, we just had, and this is good, the calling out, the attribution of Russia, and then subsequently by Mandiant of Belarus in the ghostwriter operations on the German elections, but we still haven't seen consequences come of it. And the last point I would say is we need to engage sub-national state actors, because when you look at things like ransomware, when you look at things like where do vulnerabilities really lie, it's not necessarily at the national level, although the national level is quite important, but it gets more resources. It's at the sub-national level. And then I will leave with a quote from a great cyber brain, Dmitry Aparovich, who was the co-founder of CrowdStrike, which discovered the DNC hack. It's a cyber quote, but I think it applies to technology generally. We don't have a cyber problem. We have a Russia, China, Iran, North Korea problem. And I think that the same is true with the geopolitics of technology generally. We don't have a technology problem. We have a techno-authoritarian problem, and that's what we should address. And with that, I will say thank you to you all, and I look forward to a good conference.